it, so it's vital that he keeps it. But when you get that, when you get really all of the kind of capitalist commentators, if you read their newspapers, the Financial Times, magazines like The Economists, they're in crisis. They don't know how to take the situation forward. So, columnist in The Independent, a right-wing columnist, right-wing for The Independent, and it's not a left-wing newspaper, who recently had an article saying the Western world is ripe for revolution. So, when you get them saying that, our job is to do more than just point out what's wrong, but also to point out what the alternative is and how we can achieve it. Really, you could sum up the attitude of the capitalist commentators today and the capitalist politicians. They've had to go back to what Winston Churchill famously says, where he defended capitalism by saying it's not a very good system, there are lots of things wrong with it, but it's much better than all of the alternatives. And that's what they're doing. They're not attempting to defend the capitalist system, they're only saying there's no other option, and they're not defending it because they can't. I mean, I'm not going to give loads of statistics about how bad things are, because everybody in this room knows that. But you have to give a few, because they're so shocking, they come out every day. When you get the fact that last year, during an economic crisis, the bosses of the FTSE 100 companies increased their pay by 49% in 1 year. The fact that the gap between rich and poor in Britain now, according to the High Pay Commission, which is a government quango, it's not a left-wing body, is worse than it was in the 1930s. It's back to the level it was when Queen Victoria was on the throne. It's no wonder that people are angry. And you could accept, or people would accept actually, they'd grumble about it, but they'd accept the rich being super rich if we were doing okay. You know, if they were getting loads richer, but ordinary people were getting by, then to be honest, people would grumble, but they would accept it. But of course, as everybody knows, that is very far from being the truth. This government is carrying out the biggest attack on living standards that has taken place since the end of the Second World War, against the background of there already being a huge squeeze on living standards as a result of the recession. And so we've got 1 million now, young people unemployed. We've got huge cuts in public services, which are only really just starting to bite. And all the government is prepared to offer is more pain. They're under huge pressure on the question of youth unemployment. After all, if you go back to when I first got active in politics, then the militant at that stage led a school student strike that I was involved in of 250,000 young people against the youth training schemes because we thought they were slave labour. Well, they were slave labour. But they got him off the dole and he earned £27.50 a week. I mean, we were opposed to them, but the government's not offering anything. It's not even offering that. The new scheme that they're talking about launching, which is a reflection of the pressure they're under on the issue, is working for free. It's literal slave labour. It's going and doing short-term placements and getting absolutely nothing for it, and they're saying they're going to get the money that it will cost to fund it. This is what's been announced today, by cutting working class schemes. So kids will get schemes out of which they get no jobs at the end, and they get no money, and meanwhile their parents will have even less money to feed them as a result of the cuts in working tax credit. They're also under pressure on the question of housing, because there are 5 million people who are desperate for social housing. So they've got this, it's really a kind of, it is a subprime mortgage scheme that they're talking about to try and put a bit of money in to create some housing. But it's not going to do anything. I mean, I've read articles in the press talking about it being a drop in the ocean. It's not even a drop in the ocean in reality. It's nothing. In London last year, there were 56 affordable houses built. 56! Compared to even under Labour, about 1,000 affordable houses in London were built every year. That's just nothing. But also, they're not affordable. They're 80% of market rents, or going in that direction under this government. So even the affordable housing is not affordable, and it's very noticeable. I don't know if it's started yet in Stoke, but it's definitely very clear in London. Since the recession started in 2008, you've had more and more people literally living on the streets. And at first, it was mainly workers from Eastern Europe who'd come over, who weren't entitled to benefits, and been kicked out on the streets. And that's still the case now. But you're also beginning to see, as is described in the Socialist this week, young people, 15 14, 16, 17, 18-year-olds begging, which she's not seen since the 1980s on the streets of London, because of the absolute catastrophe of what this government is offering people. So they're giving us a diet of misery. Capitalism as a system doesn't offer any improvement in living standards for the majority. It offers a driving down of living standards for the majority of the population. And there's no prospect of it getting any better. We don't mean by that capitalism will just go down and down and down. At a certain point it's going to chug along the bottom and you'll even have an anemic recovery. But it will be anemic, and it's also not on the cards in the short term. At the moment, things are set to continue to get worse. Here in Britain, they told us, didn't they, that the cuts in the public sector would be compensated for by the growth in the healthy new private sector. We certainly never believed it. I don't think anybody much believed it, but nonetheless, that was the propaganda. Now, Cameron's had to admit that despite the cuts in public spending, or rather, in part because of them, but from his point of view, despite the cuts in public spending, the deficit is not going down at the rate that they predicted. And in fact, there's the prospect that we suffer all this misery, all of these cuts in public services, in the name of getting the deficit down, and like in Greece, like in Italy, you end up with a bigger deficit at the end of it. Because, of course, as we warned, the private sector in Britain is extremely weak. You cut public sector jobs, then that means more people unemployed, less people paying taxes. Big parts of the private sector are directly dependent on the public sector, actually, and as a result themselves, businesses are going out of business. So, far from improving the situation, then the government have made it worse. But it's not just a question of bad economic policies by the government. It is a fundamental crisis of capitalism, of the system that we live under. Since 2008, in Britain alone, there's about £200 billion of value, of production, of things that would have been made, GDP that would have been added to the economy, that has been lost as a result of the economic crisis. That's enough to virtually cancel the deficit, but it's come about because of a crisis of capitalism, which is now entering a new phase. If you look at what's taking place in Europe, we export, Britain is not an island separate to Europe, Britain exports more to the Eurozone than to anywhere else, and what is developing in Europe will undoubtedly have a further negative effect on the British economy. And we just should say on this, as socialists, we always understood that the kind of super overconfidence of the capitalists during the boom before 2008, at the start of this decade, or the start of the last decade actually, that they could overcome the barriers of the nation state, which capitalism had never been able to do, and to form one currency with all these different countries from poor Greece to rich Germany, and they'd just be able to power ahead. We always warned that that would not be the case. Many on the left were swept along with the idea that globalisation is the future, that capitalism, countries no longer matter, capitalism can just be this huge global conglomerate without the nation state. But we always said, once you get a crisis, an economic crisis, then the centrifugal forces will become dominant. The battle between the different national capitalist classes to protect their profits, their bit of the system, against their competitors in other countries would become what was dominant. And of course, that is exactly what is developing in the Eurozone at the moment. And there's no way forward for them. I mean, it's very difficult at the moment to work out what is going to happen next. If you read the newspapers or watch the news, every day there's some new terrible development in a different country in Europe. And the truth is, the capitalists themselves don't have a clue. This is not, sometimes we talk about them like they're some super powerful, well, they run the world, but they're not in control of the world. They're crisis managing, rushing from catastrophe to catastrophe to try and stop the Eurozone falling apart. But what is clear is what they're agreed on is further screwing the European world ruling class in order to try and protect their project. So you've got now, in Greece, in Italy, unelected governments, bankers, stepping in to run countries in order to carry out the austerity packages that are being demanded by the Eurozone leaders. In reality, with the amendments they're making to what's called the Lisbon Treaty, but what it means is that Ireland or other countries cannot set their own budgets. They're decided effectively by German capitalism as the most powerful country in the EU. That's the reality. So you get a socialist government in Ireland, it would be able to defy German capitalism and say, no, we're going to refuse to carry out cuts. But it would have the same kind of battle as you have with local councils not having powers in Britain at the moment, because of the way that they're cranking it up, desperate to try and carry out these cuts. German capitalism effectively is trying to grab control in order, from their point of view, to save the situation and to keep the currency on the road. As yet, without going into too much economics, what they've not been prepared to do is to print money to try and stop the whole thing collapsing. To have these euro bonds, which effectively would mean the European Central Bank turning on the printing presses, printing money, in order to try and keep the whole thing on the road. It's possible, it's probable, that they'll be forced to do that to try and keep the project on the road. And that may delay a kind of breaking up of the euro a bit longer. On the other hand, they don't know and we don't know. It's on a knife edge. It could go at any point in time and it could collapse before they take that decision. But there's no good outcome from it. We don't take a nationalist position that if the Eurozone collapses, then everything will be milk and honey. For German capitalism, it won't be a way forward, because they're reliant on the euro being a relatively cheap currency, given the strength of their economy, to be able to export goods. Get rid of that, and they're going to be in real problems, and German workers will feel the pinch and be demanded to pay for the crisis. For the Greeks, going back to the drachma, their old currency, would mean real poverty, inflation, and they're already in a catastrophic situation, but would actually make the situation worse. So there's no kind of way out of this crisis on the basis of capitalism. The only way forward is a socialist solution. And that is because, at root, this has come about, yes, because of the overconfidence of the capitalist classes going for the Eurozone in the future, in the first place. They've made their own problems worse. But it's come about fundamentally because of the crisis of capitalism that exists. And that is much more than the financial markets, gambling, making loads of money. That really is the symptom, not the cause. If you look what took place during the boom, it was a period of time when you would have expected big business, the capitalists, to invest in making things, in developing industry, in doing more useful stuff with their profits. They didn't do that because they didn't think they could make a profit out of that. And capitalism is a system that is driven only by the blind drive to make profits, to make the biggest buck. And they thought they could make the biggest buck gambling on the world stock markets, and so that is what they did. But why was that the case? It's a bit oversimplistic, but fundamentally, it's what Karl Marx described 150 years ago. Working class people couldn't afford to buy the things that they'd made, the goods that they produced, because the capitalists had driven down wages in order to increase their profits. But as a result, you export all the factories to China, to Latin America, to lower wage countries, and you leave the people who did work in those factories working in Tesco. They can't afford to buy as much stuff from those factories. And the Chinese and the Latin American workers can't afford to buy them. And that really was what underlay the crisis. Now, they overcame it for a period of time by gambling on the world stock markets and by giving us credit cards and cheap credit, so we could afford to buy stuff for a while. But that came to an end, as we warned it would. And you now have the economic crisis that exists today. And socialist solutions to it are overwhelmingly obvious. Objectively speaking, if you think, how are you going to solve this problem? Socialist ideas are what come automatically to mind. But as a result of the history of the last 20 years, the kind of overconfidence of capitalism, that socialism wouldn't work, it was a system that had failed, nobody, apart from ourselves and a